without further ado, James, welcome to Unbounded Live. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Zach, and thanks everyone else for your time. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, James, when you were a kid, what did you want to do when you grew up?
Oh, that changed from age to age.
Tell us the different ages. Tell us all the changes.
So science was a big one. I always wanted to be a scientist for a long time. And that kind of evolved as I got a bit older into being a fighter pilot. And that was literally my plan until I found out I was colorblind. And so that kind of got put on the shelf. And,
how'd you find that out?
It was in engineering class, and we had, those resistors and the different colors of the bands they have on the resistors. Mm-hmm. And that's actually where they catch a lot of people out. People don't realize they're colorblind until that purpose. So I found out then. And that was the end of that. But other than that, I always had a strong interest in economics, business, science, engineering, all those kind of fields. And always wanted to do something where, it was engineering in nature, like mechanical of some sort, building things. But I liked the business complexity and the things that it takes to get things done, bringing humans into the fold. So besides those two sort of roles, those are the main ones in my head for a long time. But other than that was, learning, growing, and seeing what was available to me.
So how did you go from that to where you are today? Tell us a little bit about that journey.
Sure. Yeah. So I ended up studying electrical engineering in school, in university. And at the time, I wasn't super excited to be an electrical engineer, so to speak. I was just wanted to be an engineer, and electrical engineering seemed most attractive to me at the time. But as I started to get into it, and by the third, fourth year, I was really started loving it. And I ended up taking a job in the oil and gas industry in Australia as an engineer. So design engineering, project management. Did some pretty cool projects, bounced around the country, out in the remote areas, doing big oil refineries, hub compressors for gas transmission, all kinds of industrial things like coal ports, stockyards, the big conveyors and things like that where they get into the boats. So some great times and some really interesting projects. And the reason why I ended up getting to where I am now is largely because of Bitcoin. So when Bitcoin came on the scene in 2013, I was right in the middle of that career. And it was something that I'd been primed for. So going back to when I was sort of 16, I'd read a lot of books on economics. And one in particular, a book called The Sovereign Individual, which is written by the right-hand man of Margaret Thatcher, William Rees-Mogg, and another American, James Davidson. They were economic forecasters and like philosophers of sorts. And they predicted the rise of cyber cash, is what they termed. And they sort of like built up the case for it through cryptography, the internet, and some of the economic principles. And I was immediately very excited by the idea. And so when Bitcoin came on the scene, I kind of was made aware of it. It immediately triggered that sort of concept in my head and thought, oh, we figured it out. This is it. This is that cyber cash. And so it was hard to forget about it. I kept reading more and more about it and thinking more about it. And at the time, it was 2013, it was very contentious. It was still the Silk Road era. I know law enforcement agents were having sleepless nights about how to deal with this sort of existential threat as they saw it. And so I wanted to see the thing play out and see how regulators reacted, and sort of see how technology evolved before kind of making a jump over to kind of make a commitment or a contribution to it. But that time for me came in 2017, early 2018, when I decided that the situation was right. I understood how it was going to become mainstream. I understood the vision correctly. And I could see that everyone was starting to get their heads around it. At which point I essentially quit my job and spent 6 months just studying, writing white papers, writing business plans, kind of thinking about how I could make a contribution, which kind of led me to Tokenized.
So what is Tokenized?
So Tokenized is a company that is looking to bring smart contracts to the mainstream, the utility of smart contracts. Now you can also think of that as a digital transformation of the legal side of finance or of commerce, is another way of looking at it.
So what are smart contracts? What are the benefits of smart contracts? Why are you making this kind of your life's work?
Sure. Yeah, so smart contracts I see as a subset of commercial records that can benefit from going blockchain. That's something I think is really important. But smart contracts in particular are just basically taking any kind of contract agreement between two parties and being able to automate and digitize a lot of that agreement. So the terms and conditions, the mechanics of it. So sometimes when you think about like instruments that are being used to represent shares or other financial products, the ownership of the instrument is the signifier of who the counterparty is effectively for that agreement. And so the mechanics around managing the instruments, managing who gets what under what conditions, triggers in terms of terms that have conditions attached to them, all of that can be digitized, or a lot of it can be digitized. And then significant efficiencies can be derived in terms of products and user experiences when you build on that foundation. And there's actually some real big opportunities that start to open up when you really start to push those things to the very edge and bring it all together.
So what's one of the use cases you're excited about? Like who should be a tokenized customer today?
Sure. So we think the private markets are ripe for disruption. So private markets meaning not public companies, private companies, and private deals, private debt, any kind of instrument that's sort of considered to be a private deal. Those are largely still paper, analog based sort of economy or framework, if you will. So you think about how those processes go, it's still through email, it's still through Word documents and PDF and non-standardized contracts. They vary not only in terms of the language and the structure, but even the aesthetics, which has like an impact on the cognitive load of the people kind of participating in these negotiations and deals. So it's extremely inefficient. To cite one specific example, HSBC Security Services. So they really deal with like family offices, institutional investors in the private markets. They have a very strong demand and a lot of complaints from their customers because they're not able to get a real-time view into their investments, right? So there might be a bond that has been created and the lender wants to know what interest is due and when, and just those details, right? And really for them, the experience is sending an email to their lawyer or their trustee or their paying agent and asking them, when is this due? What is it? What am I going to get? And all that kind of stuff. And it basically takes a week for them to return the calls. The guys dive through the contracts, they get the spreadsheets out, they do the manual calculation, and then they let them know. And in today's world, unacceptable, huge amount of inefficiencies gain. And you think about the time that it takes for someone of that stature who's making big decisions and managing a lot of money, having to just deal with that administrative burden, just very, very, very costly on dollar thing. So all that can be improved significantly and brought to a standard that people expect in sort of like the public markets and pretty much the rest of the economy today.
Was the focus on making private market securities more efficient and part of the initial vision of tokenized, or is something that's evolved over time?
No, that's definitely a part of the original vision. Absolutely. So private markets are growing in importance around the world, particularly in America. And that's largely because regulatory overreach, in my view. So trying to reduce all of the risks possible where it doesn't have a return of a proportion. And it's really caused the private markets to sort of take the place of the public markets in a massive way. So it's outgrown them, all the actions happening there, all the returns are happening there. And we think that because of the way that things have evolved, liquidity can really be improved with some of these digital transformations that we describe using smart contracts in that market. And it's the only thing that can really do that in our view.
So is smart contracting new with Bitcoin?
I wouldn't say it's new, but I'd say that it hasn't, the concept has been in the people's minds for a long time, but no one's actually done the things that need to be done to make it useful, to make it actually practical and applicable. So smart contracts is a very broad term. So people misuse it all the time. If you look at Bitcoin's locking scripts, now this might be a little bit technical for everyone here, but I'll just say it anyways and say it quickly. Locking scripts are they are smart contracts in a way, and they can be used to represent certain types of agreements. Excuse me. But it's missing a major piece or many pieces that go into making it lawful and compelling and building a great product out of it. So it's very, very narrow in what it can do. And I would say the same thing about Ethereum and any other platform as well. So the degree of difference in terms of the technical capabilities between Bitcoin and Ethereum is actually fairly minor, despite all the talk and hype that people have today and thinking that it's Turing complete versus not Turing complete, and the different types of language like Solidity versus script and its sort of expressiveness is actually very, very minor when it comes to the utility and what can be done with it in a real pragmatic way. So we actually believe that we're really one of the first companies. There's a couple of companies that are fairly, they haven't got far. They're kind of thinking the same kind of things that we are, but we're the first ones to really bring it all together and make it sort of a generalized and comprehensive solution that accounts for all of the elements, all of the legalities, and all the necessary components to make this thing compelling.
And how much of your ability to do that is based on Bitcoin, or just kind of things that are unique to your company that are independent of the blockchain you're choosing to use?
Sure. So Bitcoin in particular, like BSV, is, we see the novel. It brings together all the novel and compelling components together in the right quantities and balance and proportion. So like a complex system, like a distributed ledger, these kind of parameters and design choices are incredibly important, and little changes to them can really affect the overall value. And what Bitcoin does for us is it gives something that's compelling against alternative means, like traditional means, right? So it focuses on scale, which if you can't scale, what's the point, right? You just can't store enough commercial records on it to have any meaningful impact in the world. If it's not low cost, or at least low cost enough for it to be compelling, then again, you're wasting your time. So if we're talking $50, $100 per transaction, you just can't do anything meaningful on it. There's no flexibility. You're not going to make money. It's actually cheaper, even with all the inefficiencies in the analog world, just to do it that way. So that low cost is important. And then the sort of design that it's taken, the script and the kind of design choices around that, like execution, runtime environment, is incredibly important, because it really pushes the cost and the scale to the absolute maximums, which then unlocks a whole new sort of paradigm of value. And some of the interesting things, that a way of thinking about this is, with those properties that is as low cost as it is and as efficient and as scalable as it is, it can then add into it the nature of blockchain, the properties of this data layer. You can essentially replace every single clearing and settlement network in the world and every payment network in the world with a much, much, much better user value proposition, so to speak. And the economies of scale then come into play and make it even cheaper, even more effective.
So you mentioned that there are other companies trying to do this. What makes Tokenized unique among different token and smart contracting solutions?
So not only do we have the technology that's going to make it compelling, the underlying technology that we've used to our advantage, like we've actually made our protocol really take advantage of those properties, but we've also just figured all the details out, and we've just got the correct formula. A lot of those other solutions are very half-baked. They don't understand the technology. They haven't committed to any technology in particular, and therefore they've built a very superficial protocol that does very little, and they've done so just to mitigate their own risks about committing to a particular blockchain. And they're largely focused on, in our view, winning customers over by hype rather than concrete, real value.
So what are some examples of that?
Okay, so Securitized is a good example. Polymath is a good example. If you look at the organizations, they're focused on that liquidity component with the private markets, which is 100% correct. We agree with that. But how do they get there? I mean, essentially, they're not really using blockchain at all, right? They've got like a private marketplace. That's where they're trying to generate the liquidity. It's on like traditional software. The token thing is very much a buzzword only. They support a bunch of different protocols. No one really worries anything about other than the instrument itself. And therefore they lose out on all of the other elements of the smart contract, all of the efficiencies and digital transformation components that are probably like 95% of it.
So we're using the word token here, and I think there's probably a lot of different definitions for what a token is. So when you're using the word token, like how would you define that, and what are some of the common misunderstandings around what a token is or how they're used?
Sure. So one thing that's really important to think about is the legal concept of a token, and then abstract it to the digital. So it's just an instrument. So we use the term instrument to represent, or a legal instrument or a financial instrument to represent the ownership rights of something, right? So it's really just a digital certificate for ownership. So it can be a share, it can be a bond, it can be an option, it can be a ticket, you know, like a loyalty point, those kind of things, right? Just something that you own the rights and duties to. The tokens, in our view, are a very small subset of the overall records that go into building the case for ownership. So an example to think through is if someone accidentally sent an email with a share certificate to the wrong email, and someone who wasn't expecting to become an owner of, let's say, Google in terms of shares, suddenly opened the inbox and saw that someone had accidentally sent a share certificate. It didn't have their name on it. It was the wrong email address. No one would really in their right mind think that they're suddenly the owner of Google, right? That was just a mistake, and it would be corrected in time once the parties that were involved recognize the issue. So the case to ownership is very important, right? It's not just about the certificate. It's also about the investment agreement. It's about the communique up to that, right? The intention, it's the payment itself. There's a lot of other elements that go into making the case for ownership. And for example, if you had a token on a blockchain in a non-custodial fashion that no one could touch, that you had the keys to and no one else could move it, but you never had any of those other records, or you had an email with two other people where you had a different agreement on PDF, let's say, where you'd sold the rights to that token to someone else, and that was all lawfully binding. The fact that you had the private keys to that share, for example, means very little on balance when you compare it to the other records at play, the other evidence, right? And the reason for having a token on a blockchain and having those properties of the layer, like the immutability, the transparency, all those kind of components of the data layer, are just as important to the agreement that's in the email, because that's just is equally weighted in terms of building a case for ownership as a token itself. So our view is we want to bring all of the records that build the case for ownership onto the blockchain, so they all have the same properties in terms of the data, persistence, availability, integrity, and things like that.
So you've mentioned private markets. Within the world of private markets, what segment are you targeting right now with Tokenized?
So we're targeting like municipal bonds, private debt, private equity, VCs, that type of thing, startups as well. We want them to start raising money, maybe at the beginning as well as down the line on tokenized shares. So one really clear example is municipal bonds. So in America, it's a very old school sort of system. It's typically not, there's very little activity in the secondary markets. If you go to Europe, the same type of instruments and the same kind of arrangements have a very different set. They're very liquid. They trade quite actively in the markets, and there's a whole infrastructure around that. So America is just very different, and the reasons why is complicated and perhaps just cultural as well. But it has the opportunity to definitely kind of follow that line and even go beyond that, become very, very liquid. And so these really old school paper-based, non-standardized instruments can go a long way to stripping out big costs. And then not only that, but when you have the liquidity there and the assurance that you're going to be able to sell this in the secondary market, you can reduce your sort of risk premium that you require, right? So then it sort of starts to transform the costs involved, the attractiveness, and unlocks capital generally.
So, and if I was a startup, why today would I use Tokenized to raise capital?
So it just makes the experience much, much better. So if you think about, so my experience as a startup, as well as generally, is that the raising money and dealing with agreements and things like that can be very painful. There's a very long negotiation process. And sorry, mate. And so anything you can do to make that process much, much simpler, on both sides, just adds to the value building of that company. So CEOs and executives in general are very busy, and they've got a lot of things to do. There's always more on their plate than they can do. So if you can reduce the stress and the complexity and the costs in that area, which is a major, major stress for a lot of CEOs, then that just turns into real value for everyone. And that's something that we think we can really strongly deliver on.
Do you compare to like the cost of just using like a normal safe node and back and forth and everything today? Do you have a cheaper solution for startups than kind of the standard, take some YC safe node and go back and forth?
So it would be, sorry to interrupt. It would be on par with that now, but what we're building towards is cheaper and better and more assurances. So when you start to get things on the blockchain in a standardized, structured manner using these smart contracts, then you can start to strip away the cost of even something like that, because then you know that a lot of the mechanics, a lot of the administrative costs are going to be stripped out as a minimum, but also you can start to build more compelling safe note solutions, right? So there's still a lack of transparency in those markets where it's a standard note, but then all the investors end up tweaking it and changing it, and it's all very different. And that adds, again, more rounds and more lawyers and more costs. Whereas you can, if you start to build a system where it becomes more almost like an open source code. People start to rely on it and have trust that it is used in the market. They can see it on the blockchain. It can start to really improve those processes. At least that's our thesis.
So what has Tokenized released to date right now?
So we released 2 major launches over the last 6 weeks. So 6 weeks ago, we launched our API. So the APIs are backbone of our smart contracting platform. So that's really what we call our product as a general term, as a smart contracting platform. The API allows any kind of company to embed those token, smart contract, and Bitcoin features into their products. So into their front end. An example again, so if we go back to the municipal bonds, if there's a front end that a company wants to build up that's specific to municipal bonds, it counts and caters for those customers and that user experience. We can power the entire back end, take care of all the security, all the complexity. And what they're presented with is a very simple API to interact with. In support of that value, we've recently, about 2 weeks ago now, we released our JavaScript SDK, and that allows those customers to essentially interact with our API in a much easier way. So it literally becomes a few lines of JavaScript. You don't need to know any of the terminology behind Bitcoin or the specific terms there. It's just JavaScript, very easy to understand, and you can literally get this stuff going in a matter of days.
And what products are you like working on right now for the future that haven't been released yet?
Sure. So there's our actual desktop app is in private beta right now, so we haven't actually launched that, but we've got another number of customers trying it out and playing with it. That will be launched soon. And when we do launch that, we'll be coming along with some stablecoin-like instruments. So I really don't like the term stablecoin, but we'll use it because people understand it quite well. But we want to be able to offer our platform that allows anyone to draft any kind of smart contract with any kind of instrument, and then be able to interact with their investors, their counterparties, or even just other people in the company with US dollars, euros being the medium of exchange rather than Bitcoin. So there's no volatility component there, and it will be FDIC insured or equivalent. And it will have the ability to have atomic swaps and some of the unique features and novels or properties that blockchain offers, all working on mainnet. So that's one thing we're working on.
So in terms of stable coins or stablecoin-like things on the Tokenized platform, is this something you're developing yourself or partnering with others?
So at the conference, we had a announcement. Actually, didn't know they were going to announce it, but they announced it anyways. Alt 5 Sigma. So they have a bank that we're in early negotiations with a bank, but they've agreed. The Alt 5 Sigma have agreed to work with us. So we're just basically working on the product now. But they're bringing the bank in to create that stable coin. So that's when I say it's going to be FDIC insured. It's going to be an actual bank issuing it. And some of the things that we have. So we believe that we don't need the term stablecoin because our approach allows a bank to do everything that they can do on their traditional banking infrastructure, the traditional tech, and have the same kind of visibility and control that they would in that system. So from a tech agnostic perspective, like a regulator's point of view, we're essentially extending their IT infrastructure onto the blockchain such that a portion of their operations, the money component, is on the blockchain. And therefore, it doesn't need to be called anything but e-money, which is the term they use in Europe and America for payment service providers and things like that. Just it's a US dollar, and that's all you need to know, essentially.
And then why don't you like the term stablecoins?
Well, it kind of is a bit it's inelegant, and it's a workaround, right? So most of the stable coins, they use a 0 interest rate bond as an instrument, and there's an agreement that kind of like it doesn't have FDIC insurance. It's not treated like money. It's more of a debt instrument, and they have risks associated with the issuer that aren't present with money more typically, or to a lesser degree. And the other option is really like a coupon. And so those two like instruments and those two like the risk associated with that can be averted completely with the right technical design, which is what we propose. And that we believe is a mainstream solution as well. This is what's going to take us forward.
So what are you excited about, 5, 10, 20 years in the future of Tokenized? What does a world using Tokenized look like, and why are you motivated to build that?
Sure. So Elon Musk, actually, so he's a big hero of mine, but he had a vision for PayPal, right? This is his original vision, was that he wanted a single hub, a single app or platform that handled your entire financial life in a digital way. And not only that, but built upon the digital elements to make it a significantly better user experience, right? So reminders to do things automatically done for you, a few clicks of the buttons, and warnings, software telling you, no, you can't do that. There's regulatory concerns there, or you can only do it to this degree, rather than having advisors tell you through email exactly your constraints and things like that and the efficiency there. If software will just help you do it. And we believe that he was unable to achieve that vision, as exciting as that was, because he didn't have blockchain, he didn't have Bitcoin, right? And the reason, if you'll indulge this thought experiment for a second, can you imagine the entire world economy, every company in the world, in Africa and China, all trusting PayPal servers with all of their most sensitive commercial data in America? Like, I don't think it's feasible. But in a blockchain world, it removes that component, because blockchains are essentially apolitical. There's no political risk or control from any political entities, and the same for any organization. There's no organizational risk effectively as well. So it allows countries that may be like at contention with each other to still trust and use the data set and interact with each other in an interoperable way. And we think that's really the missing piece. And then it allows for a compelling set of smart contracts, which then goes into feeding the user experience, the digital transformation. So if you look at financial messages today, like between Swift, for example, or the Swift network or bank to bank, the amount of information and message that they have largely excludes the legalities. It excludes contracts, right? That part is not digital. It's still in the analog realm. And what we think we can do with smart contracts and blockchain is expand that set of messages to include the legalities and contracts, therefore making the whole thing complete and in the digital realm, which then software can do the things that software does well. You can start to make the whole experience more automated, more efficient, more intelligent, apply AI to it. And ultimately you can get to an experience where anyone who's looking to do any kind of start a business and navigate the legal and commercial and commercial stuff can all do it on one single platform and have regulations embedded into it, have laws embedded into it, so you can't break them by virtue of the software preventing you from doing it, and making the whole thing sort of a brainless experience. You can just navigate through it and not screw up and have all the efficiencies and savings there.
In this future you outlined, do you think banks as they exist today will be as prominent?
That's an interesting question. In terms of like payments, I would say they're slowly going to lose that kind of market share, just to other payment networks and things like that are better at, more efficient at like kind of managing those compliance burdens and operations burdens. However, I do think banks as a role, as a pillar of our sort of like society, are going to continue. I don't think they're going to be nothing in the future. I would say that their role will be changed slightly, and they will not be tech companies at all. So a lot of banks are kind of like hybrids. I think the tech companies are going to start taking over the tech infrastructure, blockchain being a major component of that. And the banks are going to start to focus more on financial services and start to really compete harder in that area. But in terms of them still existing in 20 years, 15, 20 years, I think absolutely. And I don't think the degree of market share that they have is going to change by an order of magnitude by any means.
Okay, so finishing up my questions here. So just anyone else, feel free to write questions to the chat directly or to myself. But my last question for you, James, is one of our fun ones. I know you said, Elon Musk is a personal hero of yours. Is for me as well, despite, I think getting it wrong on Bitcoin and the environment, but he's a lot closer than other people. And I think for most, you don't need to agree with everyone to really respect everything that they've done and what they do. Peter Thiel is someone who, we have some of our disagreements, but I respect the hell out of him and his books, and especially 0 to 1. And the lectures I've heard have been really impactful into how I think as an investor and entrepreneur. And one of his favorite questions, and that we like to ask on kind of all of our podcasts, which is some version of his question, which is, what is something that a viewpoint that you have that most people disagree with? And, why do you have high conviction in that viewpoint? So our version of that question is just, what is something that you think most people within the BSV Bitcoin world would disagree with? That's a high conviction view that you have. And, why is that?
Obviously besides the fact that we support BSV, I would say that the philosophy of our protocol is at odds with a lot of developers and sort of like the the leading thinkers in the BSV industry. So we're very much of the opinion that it needs to be very locked down and structured, our protocol, whereas that's kind of like the antithesis of the open source culture, of the developer culture, of people who want to play and have fun in a hobby-like capacity. And we just think that that version of a protocol where it's super flexible, you can do tons of things and things like that, is not compatible with the financial mainstream protocol. And our main reasoning for that is when you look at how all these financial institutions around the world work together and how long it takes them to adopt a new standard like ISO 2022, which is the most recent financial messaging protocol. It's taken them like 15 years since that's been on the drawing board, and it still only has like something like 80-70% penetration in Western countries. So they just move so slow. And to go to a smart contracting paradigm, you're increasing the complexity in terms of like the digital records by, I think, an order of magnitude. So it needs to be super, super locked down, super structured, super standardized, which removes all the fun out of the equation and makes us contrarian to some degree.
Cool. So I'm going to start with a question from Richard Smith. Did you start with BSV Bitcoin and try other blockchains, or what was your process in terms of deciding what blockchain to use?
Sure. So Bitcoin, the original incarnation of it, 2013, was really the only one that I paid attention to at the time for those first few years. When it came to the 2017, 2018 time in my life where I really started taking it seriously, I came across Craig during that process, and he immediately ticked all my boxes in terms of like, this is a really, really smart guy making some really compelling points. And I spent a lot of time learning about his philosophy. So it was really Bitcoin, then BCH, and then BSV that was the main focus in terms of what I thought could offer the value, that combination of design parameters. But I also did look at a lot of other ones. I did spend the time, like to check and do my due diligence, so to speak, before like committing my time seriously. So I looked at a lot of networks. All of them seem to, when I compared to some of the arguments being made by sort of the Bitcoin vision, looking at them, they just seemed like they didn't have answers for them for the large part. And the design choices that they had made were superficial, and I don't think that they understood them properly. And the results weren't as compelling. And then generally, when you look at the people making these arguments and you listen to their thinking and reasoning and all the other elements to kind of establish their capabilities and competence, I just wasn't that impressed. Whereas everything in the BSV camp, which kind of was a subset of the BCH camp, I think the best engineers in the industry, the best thinkers in the industry are all centered and have congregated on this network, which makes a huge impact.
What do you see as the role of the BSV token in a tokenized powered financial system on Bitcoin?
So cash to facilitate the rails, so to speak. So I'm a big believer in it being the most efficient transfer of value, and that being the case long-term to the future. The only way I think that would be threatened, and I really don't think it will be, is serious intervention by some nation state in an attempt to subsidize and like make their currency more attractive on the global stage. But I think that every transaction is going to have, or 90% of transactions will have Satoshis moving between parties on it. I think it's critical. Our protocol essentially, at the very minimum, will have fees paid to miners using sats. So we're not a fan of the contracts that have sort of emerged, the off-chain contracts where miners have a specific contract with an entity for storing big amounts of data to the exclusion of the other miners. And the reason why is that this use case that we have, the commercial records, financial records, is not price sensitive when it comes to the fees. What's most important to us is the real-time acceptance. So we want every record to be on the chain instantly and verified, and then to move on. And like a cost of 100th of a cent is inconsequential for the most part.
So question from Oliver, what are the challenges to adopting your API or smart contracting platform?
So obviously a platform of this scope is always a commitment from the organizations that are adopting it, right? That's, they have to be sure that we're going to be around long-term and that we're going to keep delivering and doing a high quality job. It means a commitment from them in terms of resources to integrate and understand and some risks that come with it. So I think that's a hurdle that we have to get over. We have to continually prove ourselves to be someone that is capable of being a part of the financial infrastructure landscape. Also just education in general. There's just a tremendous, like some of the arguments that we're making require understanding in a few different areas and agreements with certain elements of how this is going to play out before people can really fully accept the arguments that we're making on the top. So there's a bit of, there's a challenge there in terms of the complexity of the principles that lead to the value proposition that we can actually deliver on.
Another question here from Oliver. Are you familiar with Figure, Mike Cagney's new company?
I'm not, no, I've never heard of him.
Okay. Well, Oliver, if you want to chime in and just give a little background, and maybe James can address the question then.
Yeah, I mean, I can't go into the technology of it, but Cagney was the founder of SoFi, and after leaving SoFi, started Figure, just raised a bunch of money at over a $3 billion valuation, and his goal is to kind of create smart contracts, much like what you're describing, to facilitate, primarily private debt transactions. And originally, he was looking to onboard third-party originators, and now it seems to be sort of its own ecosystem of one particular lending strategy. But ultimately, I guess, given his success with SoFi, a lot of money is kind of flocked to sort of back him as sort of a tokenization API.
So I like that approach for sure, and I like the market he's attacking. I can't comment other than that, really, to be honest. I'll have to look into it.
So we are now at the end of the question queue. So anyone on this call, feel free to ask any questions directly if you'd like. And there's a couple things I look forward to discussing kind of offline when the podcast recording is over. But just want to give the opportunity for a few more people to ask some questions.
I've got another question, if I may, Zach. How important, James, do you think it is the adoption by sort of the money center banks ahead of the private credit platforms? To what extent do you think will you need to see adoption of one or more technologies to tokenize before you can get sort of standalone private credit lenders, fintech lenders to sort of adopt your technology and kind of become market leaders in this vision for how financial services should be conducted, in the future?
Sure. So I do believe that for this thing to become extremely compelling in a mainstream sense, not just testing the waters and doing projects on it, that we're going to have a proper, again, stable coin where banks are involved, and we have some degree of assurances with the risk of the medium exchange and the utility around that. I don't see that being a major hurdle anymore. We got a lot of banks that are interested now. So the one in the US is fully committed to the agreement other than signing the line. Like, we are in active discussions about all the details about getting this thing done. They want this thing done. Also in Europe, we're talking to a number of banks as well, and they're equally as interested and keen. I think that really makes the value proposition much, much more compelling, where all questions are answered, right? So I kind of harken back to lots of conversations I've had with some pretty serious people at various companies, and I've been able to answer every single question of theirs to their satisfaction, except for that component. It still kind of is an unsatisfactory and uncompelling user experience when you have to use the traditional banking system to pay separately and then just have this token pop over to you, right? When you get into the utility and the facility that's available to payment tokens, like mediums of exchange on a tokenized protocol, for example, on blockchain, it becomes very exciting. And one specific capability that has sort of not been addressed much, but for the example here is, let's say you want to give dividends out to your investors on a monthly basis. In our system, we have this feature actually ready now, but we'll be launching it probably in about 3 or 4 weeks, is the distribution feature. So you can essentially, with a click of a mouse, select all of your shareholders and pay them all the dividend in one go, and for the cost of like 2 cents. So then that can be 1 million shareholders, That could be 50,000 shareholders, right? And then in terms of bonds, in terms of some of the instruments, any kind of distribution, like coupon payments and things like that, you can do the same kind of thing, and you don't need paying agents. You don't need sort of trustees to take that on as an administrative job that they have, where they have to get the spreadsheet out, they have to go through and do the calculations and get the list of who the people have to pay, and then go to the bank accounts and make those distributions. So there's lots of different steps there just get pulled out, and software does it and guarantees that it's correct. And then once you have that in place, you can start to push the boundaries of the degree, the amount that you're paying out, the divisibility, the size of the contracts. So it becomes compelling to be able to send dividends in 1 cent increments, right? You could send out, if you had, let's say, a very small asset like a house or a unit in an apartment, and you had 1 million shareholders that just own that one small apartment, you could literally effectively distribute to them on a monthly basis their rental income or the dividends that come from the rental income, and the fees will be inconsequential. And the amount of effort required to monitor it and actually make sure that happens is inconsequential, because software does all of it automatically. And then it starts to apply to other types of instruments, automatic execution, options agreements, more exotic type of arrangements.
Thank you, James.
So, James, key part of cyber contracts is cyber signatures. So do you see yourself as a competitor to DocuSign?
Yeah, I think those companies are not long for this world. So the digital signatures will move to more of a Bitcoin-based signature, like the ECDSA algorithm. And sort of that will be the future of all kinds of signatures, I believe. Very similar in technical principles to how the DocuSign is and all that, but it will be more comprehensive. You'll bring the signatures into be a very small part of the user experience rather than the focus of the entire company.
Well, DocuSign is so pervasive now. Do you see tokenized being actually providing that service that people need for electronic signatures?
I do. Yes, I'm very confident in that. And I mean, DocuSign is in competition with Adobe, for example, Adobe Sign. So, I mean, me as an individual, I sign equally on both, and also do a lot of manual signing when one of them gets interrupted and someone doesn't do the DocuSign correctly and things like that. So I think all of that is very disruptible, and we plan on doing that for sure.
Okay, thanks.
James, I wanted to ask about the e-money solution. I think what a lot of people in the crypto space, and I guess more pertinently for us, the BSV space, I think are looking for, let's call it a stable coin that has similar properties to BSV. Low fees can kind of permeate all across the growing app ecosystem. Is this an e-money solution for those types of parties, or is this more niche for the types of transactions that would be done through Tokenized?
So it would be a universal e-money system. So it would tackle the use cases that those proponents or the people that are interested in that would suggest. However, I would say that the costs, the regulatory costs, and the existing framework today and compliance costs are going to impose higher transaction fees on e-money or stablecoins practically than Bitcoin. So it's always going to be, you're never going to get the same like transaction fees and frictionless that Bitcoin has. At least again, unless like a sovereign nation kind of subsidizes to some degree or tries to figure out a way to make their currency more attractive than Bitcoin in some way.
One quick follow-up on that. How do you think the proliferation of e-money on BSV affects things like exchanging USD for BSV?
So you mean like sort of peer-to-peer, the ability to do peer-to-peer trades in that sense, so BSV for USD directly?
Well, just keep in mind the context here in the States is that, I live in New York City, which means that I basically can't even get BSV with USD. I don't know how much closer this would move us towards a situation where Americans or people across the world could more easily exchange USD for BSV, or if it allows the creation of exchanges more simply. I don't know if it has any impact on that problem. I'm curious if you think it does.
I think it will be tricky. It is possible, and I think that there's room. There's a degree of gray in that sort of the legalities there that it can have an impact. I wouldn't say it's clear that it will have a sustained impact in the short term, but we have actually personally have something coming online that's going to address that issue anyways. So we have a partner that's going to be able to offer to even New York and the rest of America access to BSV liquidity directly. So that's something that we're going to have as part of our platform offering as a way to address that. But will the e-money component on chain, like US dollar specifically, have an impact? I'm not 100% sure yet. I don't know. There's some uncertainty there for me.
James, definitely keep us posted as that gets closer to launch. And Jack, as you might know, Unbounded has a competitive product in that where you fill out dozens of pages and then fill out a DocuSign and then wire money, and then we can give you exposure to BSV. Only in large increments, though. Well, yeah, Dave.
Yeah, one more question I'd like to, so James, I love the vision of a single app for your entire financial life. I totally see how certain, especially from the entrepreneurial side, starting a business, how certain services that are currently popular could be disrupted, like DocuSign or cap table management. And it's, more than 10x better with tokenized. How do we bridge other services? So maybe I'm still using Chase to send wire transfers. So how do I bridge that into tokenized so that I can get closer to that single app for all of my finances in a period before everything is kind of tokenized and natively on chain, and it'll be easier for tokenized to kind of interoperate with information?
Sure. So the that partnership with the U.S. bank that I described earlier is all about, and the infrastructure we already have and have proven to work is sort of an automated onboarding, offboarding from traditional bank accounts in America or where in the world onto this tokenized system, like into your wallet. So we have like an automated way of doing that. You're still always going to be have that friction to initially get onboarded, like just because you're going from bank account to bank account in a traditional sense. But what we want to do is make it so compelling and so useful that once you got your tokenized US dollars, you can spend it so many places and use it in so many ways that it's less attractive to go back, especially when you consider the friction to get back on there. So we think of it as sort of like a one-way function, an incentive gradient that pulls people in and hopefully holds their money there. And then the world that we all hope for, which much less friction, less cost and things like that, just becomes like, starts to grow and becomes more and more like the network effects start to play and they come into it. Does that fairly answer your question?
Yeah.
Well, on that note, James, thank you so much for coming on Unbounded Live today. For all of our investor participants today, thank you for joining. And James, have a wonderful day.
You too. Thanks, everyone.